In a moment, I'm going to show you lots of drawings as examples to illustrate really clearly what I'm saying about how to get a strong sense of realism in your drawings. But for this to make the most sense, you have to do something right now, and that's to have a look around you. Whether you're inside, outside, look through the windows, look around the space you're in, look into the furthest distance you can, the furthest objects you can see. Because whatever objects you can see, I want you to look at their edges. Look at whatever edges you can see. And there'll be edges you can see within, if you like, certain subjects, and there'll be edges which are more the silhouette outline of the object, which may actually be an edge of the object, or it may simply be where the object curves away from view. Because an easy way for most of us to create a stronger sense of reality, of realism in our drawing, is to draw our edges better, more accurately, more real looking. In order to do this, we need to learn to think about them, to understand them in a slightly different way, and to observe them for more detail than we currently already are. So what I hope is that what I'm going to say now will give you a stronger sense of what you're trying to see, what you're looking out to see with edges. Because in many cases, the difference between a drawing that looks cartoon-like and a drawing that captures the sense of reality is actually the way the edges are drawn. It's not just accuracy of shape, it's how we perceive and put on paper the edges. So before we actually look at some examples, what are some of the possibilities of things that might affect how an edge look? Here are some suggestions. Are the edges I'm looking at sharp and straight? Or am I actually looking at an edge that in reality is a form moving away from us in some way? Is it a right-angled edge, or is it a razor-sharp edge? Is it a hard material or a soft material? How is the edge catching the light? Is it a sharp edge, or is it really a rounded edge? Is this edge closer or further than other edges that I'm seeing? Because it's not just how a particular edge looks, it's how all the edges look in relation to each other as well. Have a look closely at some of the edges you can see. Does the edge I'm looking at actually have any width at all, or is it simply the almost invisible point where the two planes meet? Sometimes we can see edges not because we see that edge particularly, but there's a dark value behind the edge which silhouettes the edge to us. How is the lighting affecting the way we perceive the edge? And that's whether it's in harsh sunlight or whether it's a very dull, diffusing light. And what about the colour of the object itself? How does that affect how we perceive the object's edge? It's not just the shape of the edge, it's not just the material of the edge, but it's the conditions of the lighting and of how close we are and of the other edges around it that all combine to create the visual effect of any one edge in a scene that we're drawing. But all of these factors are part of reality. We see the edges in this way because this is the way the physics of the real world and the way our human vision perceives it is. So if I want my drawings to capture the reality of the real world, then I need to be capturing the visual effects that I perceive when I look at something. And if we look at drawings that don't look particularly real, what we see is in fact the edges are all drawn with one technique, the same way. Almost invariably is a heavy, solid, continuous line. Visually, the overwhelming thing is the sameness. And we can't use the same sort of line to capture the infinite variety of how edges appear in life if we want our drawings to look real. In fact, a heavy continuous line that basically is the same whatever it's outlining is how we draw cartoons, which is why it creates a cartoon-like effect. Now, this is the way as children we probably have our first experience with art and our first technique for drawing ourselves. But if we want to start to draw as adults and capture a sense of reality, then we have to become more sophisticated in our understanding of what we see and how we can draw what we see. So instead of thinking that my goal in drawing is to copy accurately a shape or a combination of shapes that I see, I'm actually trying to capture on my paper certain visual effects, and the shapes of things I see accurately is just part of the visual effects I'm trying to capture. I need to both capture the variety, but also appropriate ways to represent that variety on my paper. And edges are particularly important because edges attract our attention, particularly the silhouette edges. So we're not just focusing on outline on the silhouette edges when we draw, and we're not just focusing on accuracy, because rather than shape, which is two-dimensional, we want to be seeing, we want to visualize form, which is three-dimensional. We want to create a sense of reality with the material of the object, with the lighting on the object, with the distance we are from the object. All of these things affect our visual perception in life, and therefore we want to capture this effect in our drawing. I realized that to draw the way I wanted to, I had to go beyond thinking about lines and start to think about marks. That created a visual effect. So let's see the impact on a number of my drawings to give you an idea of the sorts of marks you might use to create the visual effect of edges that you might come up against in your drawing. Now let's look at the edges in the drawing of this house. How has a sense of realism been created? There are some hard edges that were deliberately drawn to represent hard, straight edges that had a certain visual dominance in life. But if we look at areas of the building that are less obvious, I resisted the urge to do a straight line down here because that doesn't convey the effect of these large stone blocks very well. Where some parts come out, some parts go in. It's not just that it's an irregular line, but we actually see parts of this edge with greater clarity than others. I tried to capture that. The same thing here, and here, and here, and here, and here. With the stonework in general, when we look at the photo, we can actually pretty much make out every stone block. And it's tempting just to start to go around the edges of the stone blocks. But that ends up usually with a very heavy effect of lots of ink that doesn't reflect the reality that when I look at this house, I see some stonework in more detail simply because of where my eye happens to go. I concentrate more, but also because sometimes there's stonework which is, in a sense, in a different pattern to the rest of it. So I want to put marks, not to outline all the stone blocks, but to capture the effect of walls made of irregular stone blocks, some of which, when I glance, I see strongly, others I get a sense of by not outlining all the blocks or really outlining any of them. I create a stronger sense of reality. If we look at this stump down here, it would have been very easy at the start to just do a continuous line all around the cut edge. And yet in life, that's not how it looks. We see this part more clearly and more obviously because it's in shadow and it's closer. On the far side, parts of this we're seeing further away because this line moves towards us, away, towards us, away. There's light hitting it, there's shadows being cast on the other side of the stump because of the direction of the sun, all of which we can subtly perceive in real life. So by resisting the urge to do a heavy continuous line, I'm able to use the marks I make to create a stronger sense of reality. These trees in the distance, I want them to feel like they're far away. So again, I haven't outlined the trees. I haven't tried to draw the leaves. I've worked out what marks will create the effect, but we'll look at some other examples of trees. And please, don't leave a comment saying, you should have drawn some pictures for us to watch you drawing. Every single one of these is a video that you can watch. In each video, in much more detail, I can explain how I'm creating the edges and why I'm doing it this way. And you can see more carefully all the marks that are being made for all the edges. Look at the difference that resisting the urge to draw a heavy outline has done. It's let me reflect the fact that in life, although this actually is a silhouette, particularly where the sun is striking it, some little parts catch shadows and others don't. And the parts that capture shadows are more obvious. And that we read the edge as much by these shadows, almost joining the dots if you like, as where we actually have perhaps a black silhouette edge. With this somewhat derelict cottage, It was constructed of weatherboards of strips of timber stuck to the outside. Now again, in the photo, in life, these planks were very obvious. But if I'd drawn them all in, if I'd just done lines because I could see them and I'm outlining everything I can see lines for, this front would have been a mass of lines that would have overpowered the windows and the door. But the effect in life was that the overall shape of the cottage and the wall and these major elements visually was what was dominant. And even these weeds in the front were more dominant than all of these horizontal lines because we kind of learn not to pay attention to them. Our brain filters them out somewhat in life because they are visual clutter and we don't need to be seeing them to be understanding the meaning. And so just as our brain filters these out in reality when we look, so my drawing technique will filter them out or at least reduce the effect. And it's the same with the corrugations in the roof. I've worked at capturing the visual effect, and so that particularly pays attention to some edges, particularly the closer ones, and it creates some form with shadows rather than outline. Many people would start by doing a heavy outline, and yet this jacaranda tree, the bark is a particularly finely detailed bark. Lots of tiny little rectangular pieces, almost all arranged like some sort of rectangular jigsaw that creates various vertical and slightly horizontal patterns, and that also creates a very delicately jagged edge that again catches the light and the shadows in a certain way. All of this effect that creates reality would have been lost if I'd started by outlining the tree trunk, as is so often done. And even on this side where there's more light, I've used less lines with a lighter feel than on this dark shadowed side to reflect the fact that the sunlight actually washes out our perception of some of the detail on this side, and the shadows actually strengthen it, particularly this silhouette. A gilded chandelier, the hard metal and the, if you like, hard shadows that are cast on it work well with actually heavy, straight, smooth lines, because that's the effect we get with shiny metal. But with natural stone that's very weathered, it's a very different feeling. It would have been easy, if not intuitive even, to draw straight lines across the top of the steps because we think of steps as having edges. But generally, I'm wanting to show the variety of edges from really very rounded to still quite sharp. And one heavy-handed line across this one, and then the same for all the way up, is not going to create a realistic effect. The same with the edging on the rocks. This closer rock, yes, it's not a continuous line, but there's a series of lines with a certain weight. But when I'm up here drawing this rock further away, I have a few lighter lines again, and then some of my edges are actually defined by hatching that I'm doing to create the effect of the distant foliage that ends in a straight line. Thinking effect to create with marks rather than shapes to draw outlines of makes possible natural subjects of overwhelming complexity that are virtually impossible to draw accurately in detail in an outlining way. Again, when we have a garden here, we have rows of grass in shadow, we have a row of edging plants in front of the wall, we have some bedding plants behind, and we have a couple of hedges behind that. I've seen many drawings that have started with basically a jagged or serried line going across each of these planes, and that creates a very flat effect, as if a shape has been cut out in strips and just stacked behind each other. But by thinking what's the effect of what I'm seeing, and then what marks will capture this, I avoid doing outlines except along this stone wall, along the top of the brick wall. And you'll see, while I have done quite a bit of the stonework for these concrete blocks, I've kept the line work relatively lighter to the plants in front, because the effect in life is that these are more obvious than these. These get more attention than the blocks, even though if we look, we can see the detail. Up here, with my lines for the tree in the distance, I didn't draw it through or touching the lines for the tree in the foreground. Now, in a photo, of course, it would look as though you could do that, and it would certainly speed things up. But in life, this is where we need to go beyond what the photo is saying and to overcome the weaknesses that photography can have. In life, I actually focus on this as being forwards, which gives a very strong sense that this tree is behind, that they're not on the same plane. And so by leaving a slight gap in the marks I draw, I create the effect far more strongly that this tree is further back. I also do lines that are lighter in weight. In this house, notice that the lines I've used for this fence are far heavier, far stronger than the lines I've used in the house. But even in the house, my line work for these front windows and for this section of the roof are heavier than the lines I used for this further away section of the house, because these lines have less visual impact in life because they're further away and because they're not the focal point. And so these lines carry more weight, quite literally. This tree that's heavily in shade, it would have been very easy, and many drawings would have, a silhouette outline around the top of the canopy. A very heavy and very two-dimensional flat look. This canopy is actually more like a ball than a cutout shape of paper. And so by having darker lines closer that lighten and become less close together as they move further away from us, by trying to capture the effect of light coming down on the edge and making some parts less visually substantial than those parts that are in shade and shadow, I start to capture a sense of reality. Here we have another view in the same abbey that we saw earlier, interior section, and look at these rounded stone blocks here. Again, I could have done straight lines, and then I could have done lines to represent, but also to simplify, and I could have done lines here to outline the joints between these blocks of stone. And in a simplified way, it would have been accurate, but it wouldn't have captured the effect of these very old weathered stone in the strong sunlight, where strong shadows are cast in different parts, where these stones have weathered more. And sometimes dots and lines and short lines are more effective to convey the effect of the sunlight than even cartoon-like looking lines. We see back here the line work, even for the same thing, but just stretching back 2 or 3 meters, is very different to create the effect that this is closer than that. If we were drawing through outlines, how would we ever draw this forest scene where there are very few lines as such? It's really an accumulation of lots and lots of hatching marks to create the visual effect of lights and darks, of close and further, manipulated in a way to make the figures stand out more so they're not lost, all to capture the light effects in the reference. And if we look at this urban panorama in Edinburgh, we can see that where we have these closest buildings, our lines join up and we get corners, we get points. But as we move into the distance, we have lines that represent the larger horizontal surfaces, but they don't all join up in neat and precise ways. Because at this distance, even though we can see the detail if we want to, the effect is that we're aware of the horizontal emphasis. And so I want to capture that effect, which increases with distance. This thatched cottage was a great challenge in some ways with edges. The thatched roof, the strong sunlight that washed out parts but created dark shadows in others. This hedge along the front, trying to capture the detail of the hedge and yet not draw so much detail that it took attention away from the actual cottage. And then to draw these trees in the background so that they felt, when we saw them, that we created the effect that they were sitting far back. And as you can see, there's virtually no outlining of the canopy at all on this side. More so on this side, because this tree is actually in front of the cottage. So different effects, trying to capture a different sense of distance. If we want to capture a strong sense of realism in our drawings, I find that for me, this is the answer. I hope it may be for you too. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. All the best with this. I would really recommend that you find some of the videos that actually draw these subjects and have a look at them and see how this looks, how these marks look when they're applied mark after mark after mark on a freehand ink drawing. And you'll also get to see the reference. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun.